Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel. My name is Chantal Chateauneuf. I'm the Field Marketing Manager for Epic Games Australia and New Zealand. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists for today's GCAP Invest panel. We have Sam Ramloo from Method, Nick Pierce from Modern Storyteller, and Andrew James from Uppercut Games. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today. Can you tell us about your most recent projects? What did the funding look like for those? Nick, did you want to kick off?
Sure. So I made a game called The Forgotten City, which is it's a mystery adventure game, which is a standalone reimagining of a very successful mod for a big RPG from a few years ago. It just released in July. And so the funding for us was probably a little bit unusual. It consisted of a series of grants from Film Victoria, as well as an Unreal Dev grant, and then finally some publisher funding. There's some other stuff that we can't quite talk about yet as well, but yeah, I'm just going to focus on the stuff that I can talk about for today.
All good. How about you, Sam?
Hi, everyone. So our current project is a VR time travel adventure game called Wanderer. And we're publishing that under our game studio arm called M Theory. And it's a joint venture between M Theory and Oddboy. And essentially our funding model, we came up with a game idea a few years ago now. I think we're approaching maybe 6 years. Got some funding through the Film Commission in New Zealand, some small funding that they put through an interactive fund here, which kind of, I guess, motivated us to kind of go, yep, someone really likes this idea. There might be some merit in it. And then we put a whole lot of our own money into it to create a demo. We then presented it at a conference, an international conference, and Sony came on board as the major funder. And then we've also supplemented that with some local funding through our Callaghan Innovation Grant, which is a research and development company organization.
Great, thank you, Sam. Andrew?
Hi, everybody. Our last project was Submerged Hidden Depths, which was a sequel to a previous title we made in 2015. And so the funding for that was through, I guess they call it second party platform funding. So it was for Stadia, the platform, and it was through the publishing arm of Stadia, which is Stadia Games and Entertainment. So that was fully funded through them as the publisher and as the platform as well. So it was a fairly traditional publishing deal where everything was paid for by the publisher.
So when you were getting started with your projects and going out to pitch, how did you prepare for that? Did you identify which potential investors or platforms you wanted to pitch to? Did you do any publisher profiling? How did you prepare for that?
I'll jump in with that one. So the first thing that we did is figure out that we wanted to be independent, and so we knew we wanted to pitch to Film Victoria. Now, I don't know if anyone else has been through that process, but they strongly encourage you to have a one-on-one meeting with the fund manager before you do that. So that usually looks like a pretty friendly and chill cup of coffee with whoever's working there, or at least it did, 3-4 years ago when I went through that process for the first time. So the manager will just ask you some questions to try to understand your project better, and really their job is to try to educate you about the process, because it's a little bit, there's lots of stuff to know. And I think at that time I wanted to get the maximum funding, which was something like $150,000, but their advice was, look, don't go for the maximum funding, because essentially you're much less likely to get it unless you've got a really killer project, because everybody else is vying for the same funding. And so, if they can give more studios a smaller amount of funding each, then that's what they'll do. So yeah, there's a fair bit to learn about that process, and the process of actually filling out the application was really quite involved as well. There's lots and lots of paperwork, and there's also a very strong social component, I'd say, to the Film Victoria grant. So you need to demonstrate to the judge's satisfaction, that you're committed to particular social values relating to diversity and inclusion and accessibility and that sort of thing. So you need to be aware of those when you're going into the process. And So we originally got, I think, $65,000 from that round of funding, and in part because we were a very young and inexperienced studio, we didn't realize that doesn't go nearly as far as you hope it does. So we had to go back, I think maybe about a year later, and apply for another chunk of funding, which we got very fortunately. And then later on, we got another release grant from Film Victoria as well. So all in all, I think we got about, I think maybe $170,000 from Film Victoria, which is really just supremely helpful. And then, of course, as I said, we because we were an inexperienced studio, we didn't quite understand how much funding we needed. So this was sort of like it was a leg up, but it wasn't enough for us to actually finish the project. And so at some point we realized that, and so we started looking for additional funding, and one of the additional sources, and I'd say probably the best source of funding that you can get in the entire industry is an Unreal Dev grant, which I think is now an Unreal Mega Grant, if I'm not mistaken. So we got another chunk of cash from that program, which helped us extend our runway for a few more months, and long enough to keep going while we sort of look for a publishing deal. And that process was relatively straightforward. You just have to pitch your game to the people at Epic, and there's a little bit of guidance on the website. But the way I approached it was just thinking about it in terms of, Epic is a business, and while it's wonderful that they give away money, it's obviously also in their interests if the project that they back succeed ultimately, because they've got they can collect royalties for use of their engine. It's not very much, but still royalties. And so we tried to pitch it to them in terms of helping them to see that, if they helped the game become a commercial success, then they could, significantly increase the share of royalties that they'd ultimately expect. And so I don't know if that helped, because they don't actually tell you why they give you the grant, but I suspect it did. And so, so we were very, very fortunate, very grateful to receive some additional funding. But again, we were going to run out of runway anyway, and so probably about 2 years into the project, I made a decision that I was going to have to get a publisher. And the process for getting a publisher was that, well, first of all, you need to set up a whole bunch of meetings with publishers and go to GCAP. So not GCAP, GDC. Or at least you did at the time in 2019 when international travel was a thing. And so before that, because I had no idea what I was doing, I got in touch with a guy called John Cartwright, who runs game consulting here in Australia, in Brisbane. And he's got something like 20 plus years of solid commercial experience in the games industry. And so he, his level is just, an order of his level of knowledge is an order of magnitude greater than mine. And so he sort of coached me through the process of sort of setting up meetings for publishers and going along to those meetings. And honestly, without that advice, I probably would never have landed anything. So I'm pretty happy to have discovered him. And then so he got me onto a service called Meet to Match, which is essentially like kind of publisher speed dating. And so in San Francisco, I racked up, I think, 9 or 10 meetings with publishers, and just had one after the other over the space of a few days. And it was really useful. Like, you sort of quickly get a sense of who's interested. And it's sort of the one thing I took away from it is that finding a publisher is a numbers game. You really have to. You can't just go, oh well, I want to get published by Annapurna, and therefore that's, I'm going to put all my eggs in that basket. You have to take a sort of a scattergun approach, and meet as many publishers as you can who are interested, and then just as the coming months go on, you'll sort of, some of them will lose interest and just disappear, and you'll lose interest in some of them, and then eventually, hopefully, you'll be left with at least one publisher who's like, yep, they're interested and you're interested, and you have a good rapport. I think one bit of advice I would give about that is, one, don't pitch to your first preference publisher first, because your first pitch will be your worst. Absolutely, I promise you. And so always have at least a few practice runs pitching to publishers that you're not particularly interested in before you even consider going for your first preference. The second bit of advice is audience is everything. So if you're pitching to someone and you know who they are, you know who you're going to be meeting with, research everything you can about them. Try to understand what kind of person they are, and pitch accordingly, because your relationship is just as important as anything else, or your rapport. And I'll give you an example. When I eventually landed a deal with my publisher, Dear Villages, they later told me that one of the first questions they asked their scout is, would you like to have a beer with this person? And I was very fortunate that in that case he said yes, because he liked me. God knows why, but it worked out really well. And I liked him as well. So, you know, that rapport is critically important, because you're going to be working with these people in really stressful circumstances sometimes, and you need to have that good rapport to make sure that you have a really constructive and positive relationship.
Sam, I was actually going to ask you to chime in, because both you and Nick received your initial bits of funding from agencies. Was your experience similar to Nick's?
I mean, in the first instance, I guess for us, we're in a slightly different space in that VR was still very new at that point, you know. So when we were looking for funding, and I'm trying to remember exact years, but I think we must have been 2017 back then when we kind of came up with the game idea. This fund had been released and we thought this is an opportunity, because they were looking for new projects and this sort of, you know, something a bit different. They're a film commission essentially. And so interactive was quite a new realm for them. And so we definitely wanted to create a VR game. We thought this was a good space for us to start heading into and base our studio around. And so that initial pitch, I mean, our funding that we got from them was $25,000. So it wasn't really much at all. But I guess the thing was for us to kind of go through the process. We've all come from, so I run a creative tech studio as well, where we work, we essentially deliver creative projects as a service. So we're very used to kind of pitching projects, putting together, you know, decks for that, designs for that. I just realized I said the word deck, just making sure all the audiences out there. And so some of that in terms of design and putting our kind of best foot forward, I think some of that we kind of had because of the knowledge and experience that we'd had in the space, obviously not necessarily in the game space. And so we actually found it really, really difficult in terms of pitching, because it was such a new space, to find people who were interested in VR. You know, back then there were investors who were kind of under the radar a little bit. You know, people were still very much focused on traditional games, I guess. And, you know, back then we were talking to the likes of Oculus, were probably one of the players. There was maybe a handful of players. Quest hadn't even been, you know, released then. We'd got an inkling of something that was coming up. At that stage, it was called the Santa Cruz, I think. And so very much we were kind of looking at who could we pitch to. So our list probably wouldn't have been as long as maybe some of the others. And publishers for us at that stage wasn't really an option, again, because there just wasn't much happening in the space. We didn't, you know, we were kind of new to it as well. So we were trying to understand the space itself. And so for us, it was about putting together a really good pitch deck. And then part of that, you know, the funds that we got, while there wasn't much in there, it kind of, I guess, inspired us to kind of create a demo. And so we hired someone with the purpose of creating a demo that we thought to present what we want to present, which was quite a unique idea as well, a time travel mechanic in VR. So not only VR, but, you know, unique game within VR as well. We thought we needed to explain and showcase what we were wanting to do. So we thought a demo was going to be really, really important. So we kind of started putting all our efforts into that. And then essentially with the pitch deck in hand, some designs in hand, we started kind of trawling through all the different investment, you know, opportunities, local ones, which were kind of more smaller VC funds, and they weren't even interested in gaming, let alone VR gaming. Even now, you know, it's really hard to get gaming as part of the conversation. So then we started going out further from that, going international. And then we were at GDC in 2019 as well. And Odd Boy, the other studio that we're collabing with, were at PAX in Boston, and kind of just showcasing our wares, basically, you know, meeting with people. There were a couple of investor presentations that we signed up for, I think, again, through similar process, like a meet to match sort of process. And so I presented in there. And to be honest, I think in the end, there was a little bit of luck with kind of being at the right time, at the right place. And that, you know, someone from PlayStation saw our presentation, came to the stand where the demo was being done, had a play and kind of went, you know what, this is something really interesting. And of course, you know, without knowing kind of what we know now about where they're at in their VR journey, but they would have been looking at what games can they bring to the PlayStation, to PSVR, to try to really grow that market, you know, because Oculus and HTC, I guess, had a bit more of a handle on the market at that stage. So look, again, there was a lot of learnings for us, a lot of searching online, you know, trying to find the right contacts, going through our networks as well. But again, for us, being in VR, it was a little bit different, because the networks didn't necessarily have a lot of experience in the space. You know, there weren't any New Zealand-based companies doing VR gaming at all. Even now, it's very few and far between. So a lot of learnings and a lot of reading and just putting the feelers out. I guess in a sense, we're a little bit lucky that we had our own studios that we were managing and running that had some really good showcase of work that we were doing. Odd Boy also had a really successful game at that point, a mobile game. And so that helped kind of, you know, boost our profile and reputation. We'd been around as a creative studio for now 18 years, but all of that just really helped boost our reputation. Yeah.
That's great. And that point you made about PlayStation looking to grow their market, I think really dovetails nicely into submerged hidden depths. So Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about what your engagement looked like with Google Stadia?
Well, I was actually talking to some of the other guys over the weekend about answering this question, and it was a very convoluted road from the idea of doing submerged to then, you know, signing a deal with Stadia. And actually started with us pitching a different project. And we decided, after doing independent development, I guess at this point it was about, for 8 years, we've been self-funding, and very, very quickly we received numerous grants from Screen Australia, Interactive Games Fund and things previously. So we're talking about making a sequel to the game that's been previously funded through the government program. We're now sort of looking at spending our own money on the last 2 games, and we thought, look, we need a publishing partner. We need someone to help fund. And our initial approach was to go after the platforms first. So we went to GCAP. We had some meetings and did some presentations with Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo. Google, like Stadia, wasn't actually a thing at this time. And so we're actually pitching another game. And in that, I think we had a call. We've been, as Sam said, about reaching out to your networks. We had a call with Morgan, and he had mentioned in passing, oh, there's this Yeti thing I've heard about. Like, I've never heard of the Yeti. He's like, yeah, you should go, you know, see if you can find out what that is. That's might be a lead. It was a sort of an off the cuff comment. So then we actually contacted Jay Wilbur at Epic, and he put us onto another person at Epic who knew somebody at Google, who then put us onto somebody at Stadia Games and Entertainment. And in the same light as, like, sort of right place at the right time, we actually had the 2 products. One of them was Submerged Hidden Depths, and the other one was another game. And Submerged, for them, really hit a niche that they were looking at for their platform lineup. They hadn't launched the platform. They hadn't even announced the platform at that point. And so I think there's a bit of luck, but then there's also having a history. So as part of this conversation we're having, 3 years earlier, we'd actually done a mobile game for Google for their Tango platform, which was basically really early AR hardware that was in a specific small amount of handsets. I can't remember who the manufacturer was, but that was a very early AR thing, and we did basically a paid launch title for that platform, which ultimately wasn't very successful, didn't make any money. But we had the history of, oh, we've worked for this other completely different arm of Google and delivered a product. You know, I think we asked them to go and talk to those people. You know, I'm not even sure if that department even exists anymore. But yeah, so we had a rapport that was totally unrelated, and then that got us into the door, and also just through contacts through networks, and having the history, like Sam also mentioned, you know, they had a studio that had been running for whatever those 18 years. We'd also shipped about 5 or 6 games to this point, so there's a bit of trust involved there that you can only build up through actually staying in business. So yeah, right place at the right time, some lucky connections through our networks, and having the right product as well that fit a niche that in their catalog. So yeah.
Just for clarity, Andrew, what would you say that niche was? What do you think it was
It was,
that
sorry,
go
yeah, it
ahead.
was very clearly a family-friendly product with wide audience appeal. So not core, not the core gamer shooter sort of demographic, but something that could appeal to wider audience. And also at that time, having something that was basically graphically impressive but easy to get into. It's like to a very accessible product that anyone can jump in and play. So that was the sort of the category.
Can I just jump in and just on that niche? I mean, while we did find it a bit tricky finding, because I guess there's not as many avenues, definitely agree with, kind of going for the platforms to begin with and the hardware sort of specialist. But for us in the end, I think what got us across the line was that we were a niche game, in a niche area and something that people were wanting to grow. And so we knew that we were going to have this kind of, it might be difficult for us, but if we were able to cut through, we had a really good idea that if someone was, kind of looking out for something a little bit unique, that was actually what was going to get us across the line. Another thing actually, and I don't know if you guys have experienced the same thing, but interestingly, at that initial meeting and conversation, there was a lot of advice given to us as well by the, by the PlayStation kind of rep, and that we'd had an idea of doing this game that was episodic, long-term, all of this. And they said, look, just concentrate on getting it, put it all into one. And so some of the advice that they gave us at that time as well, we took on board and changed our pitch slightly to then work for that and then pitched it back to them. So I think that's also really important, in that not getting too kind of stuck in your ideas and not wanting to move in any of that. Being able to make some of those compromises to it, because they know the audience, these guys know what works. And so for us, we had this idea and it didn't go too far away from our vision. We were able to make some of those changes and pitch back, which I think is also just something in terms of taking up good advice and showing people that you're listening to their advice.
Yeah, I think that's really important advice. Nick, with your experience with Dear Villages, what would you say it was about your project that got it over the line?
Look, it's a complex question because I don't know what else they were looking at. And they don't really, I don't think they have a really sort of clear set of rules about the sort of projects they normally sign. But certainly, probably the sort of the secret weapon that we had, which made a lot of people interested in the project, was the fact that it was a standalone reimagining of a mod. So the mod has 3.7 million downloads and was the first, I think the only mod in history to win a National Writers Guild Award, and was just very well received critically as well. So that opened a huge amount of doors for us. And I worry that that's not especially useful advice for junior indies who are, well, I don't have a mod like that. But I think to someone who is earlier in the progress they're making in the industry, like if you're wanting to get into game dev, then certainly I would suggest modding as an excellent path for teaching yourself, and even as an alternative pathway to sort of traditional formal education. I don't have a game design degree or anything like that, and neither did my artist, but it hasn't in any way hindered us or our progress. Modding is exceptional because you get to use world-class tools. So not just the engine, but also all the tools that are built on the engine. So for example, if you've got a story idea and you want to see if it works as a game, you can just build that as a mod, and you've already got tools for creating characters and automatically generating lip sync and that sort of thing, which it's very difficult and expensive to do as an indie. And you also have a ready-made audience. So some of these modding communities have millions and millions of people who are already actively browsing through these databases of mods, and so will happily play your mod, and if they like it, they'll follow you on social media. So that is certainly one viable way of building up, of sort of preparing to make a game and really testing your concept to see if it works. But yeah, in the end, having that mod under our belt was super helpful, and I doubt we would have got to where we are without it.
Well, Nick, I realize not everyone might have a mod that they're basing their game on, but I think this story speaks to something really interesting, which is, not every game that you're pitching, has to be, wholly original. Like you're basing it on something existing that people have played, and you built on that world.
Yeah, and Nick, you were just mentioning before, how much of what we're kind of talking about is useful potentially for indie game devs, putting together a pitch. Some of them might not have the same experience and all that, but again, to that, like we didn't have necessary game experience in the space. One thing I would say is though, in putting together our pitch decks and thinking about the content we were presenting, we're really conscious of the less is more concept. And that's in terms of if you've got an idea that you're really, really passionate about, sometimes you could take up screeds and screeds of pages talking about it. But when you're putting this information in front of, funders and people that you want to kind of attract to your project, I guess just making sure, again, that you can be as succinct as possible. In developing our pitch for the interactive fund, we had to put together a log line, a paragraph, and through other work that we'd obviously done with clients, we know to get an idea across, we only have so much time to do that. And so I think, rather than trying to over and explain your game and getting someone across the line, kind of bringing that back to what is the most important thing for them, and then also what's going to appeal to their audience. I think just thinking about some of those things, which kind of brings in the experience factor, so I know as someone who gets really passionate about the content that you're delivering and you want to create, you could talk about it for hours, but really holding back on some of that and go, well, what's the person who I'm talking to really, really interested about? What's the genre? How could I break it down? If I had to put bullets down, what would those bullets be? It's your elevator pitch essentially. And so just being really conscious of that. Yeah.
Totally agree. And I've got an anecdote to illustrate that point nicely. So my first press meeting at GDC in, I think, 2018 was with the editor-in-chief of PC Gamer, which again is a ridiculous first meeting to have because you really should start your way up and sort of finish with the boss fights. Nevertheless, so I had my PR guy with me, but unfortunately I had forgotten my press pass or my access pass, so I couldn't get into the meeting. So he gave me his so I could go in and he had to stay outside. So not only was I doing the boss fight on my very first press meeting, it was with editor-in-chief of PC Gaming. So that was kind of nerve-wracking, but and to make matters worse, I had a look through his Twitter feed before meeting him, and he was an FPS guy, and my game is absolutely not an FPS game. So I had to ask, how am I going to, one, get this guy interested in a game that's not an FPS game, and two, just even function in this meeting. And so when I dug further into his Twitter feed, I realized that he's a self-described Star Trek Next Generation fan. And so I thought, all right, how do I liken my game to that? Okay, I've got it. So basically, my game has been described as being very, very similar to one of the greatest episodes of Star Trek Next Generation of all time, The Inner Light. And so I walked into the meeting and said, do you like the Star Trek Next Generation episode, The Inner Light? And his eyes just dilated on the spot. He just went, oh, yeah. And then I said, this game is basically an interactive version of that, but you've got multiple endings because it's a video game. And he was just in. And for that reason, well, one thing led to another, and we got the game included in the PC Gaming Show of 2018. Our first trailer was announced at the PC Gaming Show. So yeah, I think that the point of that anecdote is that, as Sam said, you really have to do research into, and it feels bad saying do your research at the moment because that phrase has been co-opted by some interesting people, but you really have to do research into the interests of whoever you're pitching and try to tailor it to them, because you don't get more than one chance to pitch these things, and it's all very subjective. So yeah.
That was actually a nice segue into my next question, which was, looking at the deals, how that process worked in terms of you negotiating deals with the publishers and platforms that you're working with. Now, I realize speaking to specifics isn't necessarily possible, but I just wanted to ask the question in terms of what kinds of deals had you heard about before you went in to negotiate your own? Were there, any myths or, horror stories you'd heard about that you may have come across through your own process?
The first advice that I got from other experienced devs was just at having beers at events at GDC, and one of the sort of golden rules that I heard then, and which by all accounts seems to be pretty consistent throughout the industry from everyone I've spoken to since, is that there are sort of three non-negotiables in a publishing deal, or you should get as close as this as you can. One is keep your IP, if it's a sort of standard indie publishing deal. Two is your recoup should be around 100% of whatever your advance is. So, for example, if they give you $1 million, then as an advance, then they should recoup no more than $1 million before they start paying you royalties. And the third one is that an approximate guide for a good revenue split is 70-30 in your favor. In other words, once the game has recouped on the advance, that you should get 70% of the revenue as royalties. That's after the platform takes its cut, while the publisher takes about 30%. And you can push, you know, if you're lucky, you might get a little bit better than that, or you might have to settle for a little bit worse than that. But as a general rule, I would say that's something worth pushing for.
There was nothing kind of really, we didn't, again, have a lot of experience in that space. So, but what we did have experience with was putting budgets together for projects and the like. And so for us, it was really, well, what are we going to need to make this game? You know, we were very much aware of, this is our first serious game that we want to create. For us, as long as we got enough money to make it happen, that was going to be the big thing, you know. And I don't think in hindsight we would have changed much, except probably just allowed for a bit of movement as everything, you know, as deadlines change. So we would have just allowed for more money in that sense. I think we potentially undercut ourselves just because, again, we were a bit inexperienced. We weren't sure what numbers were going to fly. At the same time, we're kind of like going, look, we're talking to big companies here who are funding hundreds of millions of dollars worth of games. What we're asking for isn't, you know, it's a drop in the bucket, but we also want to make sure it gets across the line. So it's a real fine balance. And I think the main thing was also kind of going through that budget and just making sure we'd considered everything possible, you know, not just to develop the game, but to run a studio as well. Is if we got this funding tomorrow, what would we need, you know? And part of it, because we were established companies, we could have very easily overlooked the fact that we were already renting a space. We had some computers and hardware and software and all of that happening, but actually making sure that we needed to consider all of that as part of the funding for the game, because we were going to split out and do that separately. And so it was very easy to kind of go, you know, to forget about things like office rent and stuff, because we were kind of already paying it. So just making sure, I guess, that you're dotting, you know, dotting all your I's and crossing your T's in terms of all the different things that go into it, everything down to what it needs, what you need to run your kitchen, you know, the usual things, and setting up sort of a business to run, and having all of those, not just to develop the game as a project, which is what we were used to, as, you know, running a studio and running these projects. So just considering all of that. And I guess that's where maybe doing that and then adding a contingency on top as a percentage. But definitely agree with Nick in terms of, you know, your terms. And again, we didn't really know. We were really lucky in that the deal that we got, we weren't taken advantage of. And I think we would have very quickly kind of said, hey, this doesn't sound right. But I guess it's also important to consider, once you finish the game, what does your runway look like, you know? And the last thing I'd just say is that also thinking about marketing, that's often something that's overlooked, and that you go, okay, I need this much to create the game, and you've completely forgotten about how you're going to go out there and promote the game and market the game. And we're lucky in that our deal includes a little bit of marketing, you know, in terms of in kind with Sony, but we still also kind of thought about, we'd have to go and do some of the conferences again. I mean, that's not going to happen now, but thinking about all of that sort of stuff as well, which is often not front of mind. And you get to the end, you've created a game, and you're like, oh crap, basically I've got no way of getting it out there, you know. So just thinking about all of those, and I think going a little bit higher rather than lower is always going to, you know, be better. You'd be better off. Yeah.
I think the other thing to think about is what other services the publisher's providing. Like again, I think being getting a sort of almost a second party deal with Google, some of the things that came with that publishing deal were QA, localization, and UX testing, and they were invaluable, and they're something we've never been able to afford. You know, very high quality localization, user experience testing. I mean, there's no way indies can do that. Really, you take your game to PAX and watch people on the floor. It's not a scientific process like Google was able to provide. And so there's a value add there that may or may not happen depending on which publisher you go through and how they structure paying for those things. And yeah, and again, we were very lucky because it was a a platform paying for this. They they wanted the games on their platform, so that a lot of that came out of just the platform budget, not our development budget. But every deal is different, so you got to look at what you're getting and weigh that up against other opportunities if you have them. Yeah.
Yeah, that actually dovetails really nicely into my next question, which is, at this stage, you all have publishers, platforms on board for your projects. What did it then feel like to keep working on a project when you have this responsibility to other stakeholders? Did it change your creative direction? Did it put pressure on you? Basically, what sort of advice can you give to other developers to prepare for these kinds of opportunities?
Anecdotally, I have heard of other people having really hostile relationships with publishers because the publisher wants you to make changes and you don't want to, or that someone is being unreasonable, or that was certainly not my experience. And I think one of the reasons for that is because right from the beginning, rapport was really important, and so you have to sort of go into it thinking of this person, this group of people as sort of colleagues and collaborators, not sort of adversaries, and not a sort of business mother-in-law. And so you just, if you work on the relationship and just make sure that you're really sort of pleasant, polite, then that goes a long way, because the relationship will get strained. It always sort of starts high and goes a little bit lower as more challenges crop up. In the end, my publisher was great to work with insofar as they had absolutely no interest in ever asking me to change the game. They had a really like a deliberate sort of hands-off policy. So they were just like, this is your game, we're going to support it, but you've got all the creative decisions come down to you. That was great. And I think not all of them are going to be like that. So I guess probably what you would want to do is ask around. In fact, I did, but before I made the deal with Dear Villages, I got in touch with all of the devs from the games that they'd published and just asked about their experience, and it came back universally positive, which is not something I can say in respect of other publishers I did the same research for. So yeah, I think one, working on that relationship from the beginning, being polite, respectful, courteous, and collaborative, and also just making sure that you sort of getting into bed with the kind of person that you actually want to work with are both pretty important.
From our point of view, we're really lucky in that we've got we've never kind of had any direction imposed on us in terms of creative or narrative. In that sense, we've very much kind of been just kind of get on with it. However, I kind of think the other thing with that is also gaining the respect of the funder or the company that you're working with is really important. Like, one of the things we've established right from the beginning was a really clear communication pathway with them. We had regular meetings with our account managers set up right from the beginning, so checking in, and with the marketing team, being really engaged and proactive rather than waiting for them to sort of chase up on stuff has been really, really important, especially now in the last sort of year where our milestones have moved. And it's been very, it could have been very easy to go, oh my goodness, we don't want to tell them we're moving our deadlines again. But actually being really honest about it and going, this is where we're at. And I think from our point of view, that's really only helped the relationship, the more opportunities we have in terms of talking to them. So I think that's really important, even though they have been quite, hands off in terms of expectations. If you can then kind of keep them up to date, I think that would go a long way as to if there was ever anything that you had to have a serious conversation about, you've got those lines of communications. For us, we've also built a really, really good partnership with their marketing team in terms of being responsive, making sure we're in the, I did a really detailed marketing plan and putting the information in front of them and being really organized with your own stuff, so them not turning around, because we have got a marketing deal with them. And I think it'd be quite easy for some people to probably look at that and go, oh, look, that might not matter as much, or I don't know necessarily what we're doing with marketing. They'll just handle it all for us. But you still have to be really proactive with that stuff. That money is, as I said, in kind. So it's not dollars that you get, but essentially ads within social and all of those. And so we've been really lucky in that every time there's a VR showcase, we've been included in it, one, because we were kind of in there right from the beginning going, what does your schedule look like? How can we include our stuff in it? What are you looking for? Setting up weekly meetings at points as well, where we were launching trailers, and just being really proactive with that and making sure that you're offering that information rather than waiting for them to come calling for it.
Yeah, I'd agree with Sam about that communication channel, and it's not about like hiding bad news. It's about actually having that trust, so that when there is bad news that pops up, when something goes wrong, they trust that you're on top of it. Okay, this thing's gone wrong, we need to change some things, but they trust that, okay, where'd this come from? It's out of the blue. We've never heard about this. That's not the conversation you want to have. You want to be saying, that thing we warned you about 3 months ago, yeah, it happened. So here's our plan to fix it.
Yeah.
And most people will, work with you in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I was just going to say, when you tell a publisher that you are not going to meet a deadline, like a milestone, I mean, technically you might be in breach of your contract. And, if they don't want to work with you anymore, if the trust is gone, then they potentially could terminate, and it could have a very serious outcome. And so the importance of having that positive relationship with good open communication is that, if you get into that situation, as we did, it's not a big deal at all. They just, yeah, sure, no worries, because they trusted us, and we trusted them enough to be open with them about what was happening. And so, yeah, it wasn't an issue in the end. So yeah, I
think dealing with lots of developers, they realize that things change, and this thing you said you were going to deliver 5 months ago, now that got kicked back because this other thing's coming. And as long as that's all signposted early and they know what's coming down the road, then you don't have issues.
So we've touched on some really important things here, which are, honesty, open communication with your publisher. Before we wrap up, do any of you have any parting words of wisdom for game devs in the audience today?
I have a confession, and that is, when I started making The Forgotten City, I smugly and naively thought that because it was based on a mod that was already pretty well developed and quite clear in its scope, that I was going to be able to knock over the project in 2 years. It took me 4.5 years to get to the finish line. And so I think, looking back, I really had no way of knowing just how long it was going to take me or how much money it was going to cost. But I think as a general rule, if you in your heart of hearts believe that a game is going to cost you, I don't know, $500,000 to make, it's going to cost you $1 million at least. And same goes for the amount of time. So if you're a first time dev, by all means, plan out your schedule and plan out your budget, but you need to be prepared for the fact that it's gonna be double at least.
I think even an organized studio that has lots of, you can look back. We've got everything in, all our time booked on projects and things, and we still look at things and go, we need to just add 20 to 30% of unknown at the end because stuff happens that you can't plan for.
Yeah, I feel like, it sounds, massive saying double everything, but honestly, you just, if anything, even if you do fall short, then you've got time to make up for. But I doubt that would ever happen. But double your budget, double your time. Think about your own investment in this as well, as an owner and creator and running that studio. Time is more than just hours in a day. Like double what you think you'd invest in it mentally and physically, because your brain space gets taken up with it, right? So it's not just, I know most owners don't spend 8 hours a day, but just don't expect that. The other thing I would also just say is, and I know it's real topical at the moment, but just this idea of running a studio these days and making sure that everyone's really taken care of, again, the team are on this journey with you. So whatever team you're building, that culture fit is so important. as part of that journey. You know, you're never going to find, with some advice we got a very early on in our kind of in our entrepreneurial journey, essentially, was that you know, it'd be really rare for you to find someone who's as passionate as you are about the project you're working on. The best you can hope for is that, you know, they come at least sort of 70% of the way potentially. And so don't ever expect someone to potentially give it as much as, you know, as much effort as you are, because at the end of the day, they don't own the business. But if you get the culture fit right, I think there's so much time and energy that gets invested in that. At least if you have that right, that's one less thing to kind of have to worry about day to day.
Yeah, I think an anecdote to I could leave us on is, for my part, is when we were speaking to Google early in the process about submerged hidden depths, they were asking us how much are you going to expand, and we're like, well, there's only 7 of us at the moment. We look like we need a team of, maybe we need a team of 25, and they're like, 2 years, like that'll just destroy your culture. No, you come back to us and have a think about what you can do in a sustainable way, and not just sort of blow the studio up in the process, because that's not going to get us a good product either. And I think we got to a middle ground. I think we had 16 people full time and a whole bunch of collaborators on the project. But even they were looking from the very top down as a publisher and a platform holder, going, you can't just have this crazy rapid growth that doesn't just implode the social structure of your studio if you just bring in so many people over a short period of time. So it's another thing. Yeah, I think it's definitely a part of the equation. You have to grow that sustainably and take time. Yep.
I think that's a really great point to end on. Sam, Andrew, Nick, thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time and you sharing your experiences with our audience today. So thank you so much, everyone.
Kia ora, thank you.
Pleasure.